After years of mistreatment, the citizens of the 13 colonies decided they needed representation. And when that didn't come, they led a rebellion against Great Britain.
In September of the year 1620, a ship left the port of Plymouth, England, full of 40 separatist and merchant supplies. The self-proclaimed saint wanted to create a new church in the New World. Why is it redundant? I feel like we should change that.
They hoped to avoid persecution from the churches in Europe. So they then created the Mayflower Compact. And 70 years after the landing, their colony grew to 3,000 people. This was the second major colony in the New World.
King James I separated the Atlantic seaboard into two parts, the southern half to the London Company and the north half to the Plymouth Company. The colonies consisted of New England, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, and the middle colonies, New York, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, and finally the southern colonies, Carolina. These 13 colonies will be the setting of some of the most important series of events in all of history. On March 5, 1770, after years of growing and growing, a city was not a strange sight to see in colonial America. But on this day was the turning point of the public's point of view of the English government. British soldiers came to keep the peace between a sentry and townspeople. The townspeople had been insulting and snowballing the sentry. The squadron stood guard, ready to act. An unknown influence caused the first shot, which followed with many others. Civilians had been killed, and this event was known as the Boston Massacre. It echoed through the colonies with the help of an engraving done by the famed Paul Revere. The engraving portrayed British soldiers firing upon the distressed civilians. This caused an increase in rioting and public protests, which led to the removal of British troops from Boston. The East India Company, a company that grew to have political power, came across troubling times. As a way to save the company, the English Parliament enacted the Tea Act in 1773. The Tea Act was enacted not to upset the colonists, but as a way to bail out the East India Company. Merchants in New York, Philly, and Charleston denied the tea imports. Further north in Boston, even though under patriotic pressure, some merchants still accepted the tea. Tension rose all across the colonies, and the rebellions were exponentially more common. After a long time of pressure from the Patriots, the people who had been accepting the tea finally gave in. This showed the reality behind the two sides of the war, and that something was to come. So, Professor Schusterman, do you think you could tell us a fun fact about the Boston Tea Party?
I actually can. So, it actually took about 3 hours, and it took 100 colonists to dump all the tea, and it ended up being about close to 100,000 pounds of tea, so 49 tons. And if you convert all that money to now, it's actually close to $1 million worth of tea that they dumped.
Wow, that's crazy. Thank you.
You like that number conversion?
Patriots, specifically the Sons of Liberty, were upset. They disguised themselves as Indians and boarded the merchant ships. They then proceeded to dump the tea. It took over 100 colonists 3 hours to dump 49 tons of tea. Converted to today's money, they dumped about $1 million worth of tea. As of a result of the Boston Tea Party, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts of 1774. It was intended to punish the colony in general, but especially Boston.
Years ride, the Patriots and the Loyalists engaged in battles all across the 13 colonies.
April 18, 1775. Hundreds of soldiers were headed from Concord to Boston. News had been received that colonists were stockpiling weapons and ammunition, weapons that could be used in lethal rebellions. While arriving in Lexington, the sight of 70 Minutemen appeared to the Brits, all men armed and ready to take action. Suspense rose and finally someone fired a shot. Hence, the shot heard round the world. The battle had begun. After the clash, 8 Minutemen were dead and 8 injured, while only 1 Brit was injured. The British soldiers continued their march. Concord's North Ridge. The British had nowhere to go, so they had to fight. The exchanging of bullets occurred, and it set the Brits running back to Boston, being picked off one by colonists along the way. The revolution had begun. Henry Longfellow once wrote, on the 18th of April in 75, who remembers that famous day and year, he said to his friend, if the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church Tower as a signal light, one if by land and two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be. This famous poem was a creative and very accurate way of describing Paul Revere's ride. But there is more to this story. Paul Revere was not the only hero. Paul Revere brought news of a possible British invasion to the city of Lexington, giving them time to prepare. Revere was no extraordinary man, other than his exceptional craftsman skills and abilities to create wonderful pieces like pictures, cartoons, metal art, bookplates, and music. He even practiced some dentistry. It all began with his suspicion. He spotted men that were drawing out British watercraft to be repaired. It was obvious something was going to happen. He met with Patriot leaders to plan the notice of the ways the British would take their attack. They decided. One lantern meant the Brits came by land through the Boston Neck, and 2 lanterns meant that they crossed the Charles River by boat to Cambridge. This is where the Old North Church came to be of influence. The church was in the perfect position to be seen across the Charles River. As the time came, Revere had to escape Boston to avoid being captured. But on his way to Concord, him and 2 other men, Dawes and Prescott, came upon a roadblock. They decided they had to break through. Prescott was the only one of the 3 that was able to escape, and warned the others, while later, the other 2 were released by the fear of the British soldiers.
Several key battles had an influence on the outcome of the Revolutionary War.
A patriot was a person that felt that the British were not treating them fairly, so they wanted freedom from British rule. Many patriots are still remembered today, most influential being people like Paul Revere, Sam Adams, George Washington, Ethan Allen, Patrick Henry, and Ben Franklin. Thomas Jefferson, a mastermind amongst the patriots. He was the man with the ideas, and he helped create the Declaration of Independence. He pulled ideas from all over and put them together. Of course he did this with the help of others. People like Ben Franklin, John Adams, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman all had their part in this important document. They spent hours on end meeting and compiling ideas, brainstorming to get the words just right, while at the same time avoiding redcoats. All of them were patriots, but what is of the loyalists? Not everyone agreed with the patriots. These people believed that what England was doing was right. There were a few that stood out, people like Benedict Arnold, who betrayed the Continental Army, Joseph Galloway, and Thomas Hutchinson, the governor of the Massachusetts colony.
So, Professor Martinez, what do you know about the morale of the Patriots during the war?
Well, the Patriots and the 13 colonies fought back with great confidence. The Battle of Bunker Hill, even though it was called Bunker Hill, was fought on Breed Hill. And they built a dirt fort to defend themselves from the British.
Do you know why they built, that they had the battle and they built their fort on Breed's Hill instead of Bunker Hill?
No.
The date is April 19th, 1775, and on this day, a battle marks the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. After receiving news of the British movement, militia assembled to intercept the British. Their only objective was to keep the redcoats from reaching their stockpile. After a confrontation on the Lexington town green, the British soldiers began to retreat back towards Boston. It was during this battle the shot heard round the world was made famous. Although being heavily damaged by the Royal Army, the Patriots did not lose confidence. Patriots were inflicting just as much damage back to England. So on June 17, 1775, 1,000 militiamen built a dirt fort on top of Breed's Hill instead of Bunker Hill. Although the battle is named Bunker Hill, the majority of the fighting took place on Breed's Hill. The Patriots had to conserve their ammo. "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," said Prescott, their commanding colonel. They managed to cut down 1,000 British troops, killing 200 and injuring 800. After running low on ammo, Prescott retreated his men, having only lost 100 and wounded 300. The victory for the British was high-priced, showing that the war against the colonies will be long and expensive. The turning point of the Revolution. Saratoga was fought in 2 battles. These battles were 18 days apart from each other in the fall of 1777. On September 19th, British General John Burgoyne won a small but very costly battle against Benedict Arnold and his men. The general lost a lot of troop power, but then decided to attack again. This time he attacked and was forced to retreat. 10 days later he surrendered. This American victory convinced France that they were fighting on the right side, and led them to provide military and monetary support. On September 28, 1781, George Washington commanded a brigade consisting of 17,000 Continental and French men. They were to battle for control in Virginia against 9,000 redcoats. It was here that the most important battle in the war took place. After battling for days and after being trapped in and bombarded with cannon fire, Cornwallis surrendered. The French had blocked their escape by land and by water with American troops and French ships. At the formal surrender ceremony, Cornwallis did not attend by reason of illness, but instead his second-hand man came and turned in his sword. The year is 1783, and a very important document was being created, the Treaty of Paris. It ended the Revolutionary War and showed American independence. They were finally free from the cruel hands of the British. Adams, Franklin, and Jay were the signers of this great treaty, giving all the British land to the Patriots. This was the beginning of a marvelous country.
After winning the Revolutionary War, the colonists decided they needed a proper government. As a result, they created the Constitution.
Do you think you could tell us a little something about the Articles of Confederation?
The first written Constitution of the United States, it began in progress during the war, but after the war progress slowed as the fear of giving too much power to one branch of the states claiming land. They knew that this idea wouldn't work, and well, the Constitutional Convention in 1787 to create a new law. Draft after draft was put out until the most reliable one was made.
It's interesting, thank you.
The Articles of Confederation, the first written constitution of the United States. It began its progress during the war, but after the war, progress slowed as fear of giving too much power to one branch came to hand. They knew that this idea wouldn't work and held the Constitutional Convention in 1787 to create new federal laws. Draft after draft was put out until the most reliable one was made. The Constitution, America's first national government, consisted of Basic and Fundamental Rights was signed on September 17, 1787, by delegates of the convention in Philadelphia. This new draft was proposed at the convention. It would have 3 branches: the executive, legislative, and judicial. They also developed a system of checks and balances so that one branch did not have too much power. But it was not yet perfect, and more changes had to come. Changes had to be made. There were holes in the Constitution that had to be filled. So along came the Bill of Rights. It was officially a part of the Constitution in December of 1791, thanks to the perseverance of James Madison. It consisted of 10 amendments. Number 1, the freedom of speech. 2, the right to bear arms. 3, soldiers being quartered in your home. 4, unreasonable searches. 5, court. 6, speedy and public trial. 7, common law. 8, excessive bail. 9, enumeration and constitution. And 10, powers not to the U.S. but reserved to the state and to the people. And it was these 10 that began the perfection of the Constitution, to which this day has been amended 27 times. America has come to be one of the greatest countries in all of mankind. Thanks to the human nature of desiring to progress, amazing things have been done. And with this progression, we will proceed to help mankind, as a country and as a world. Let this be a story for our descendants to remember. Anything is possible with human ingenuity.